Well, hello, chemistry students. This is Mr. Suker coming to you from the BTA garage with our first chemistry flipped lesson. This one is going to be on scientific ethics. In order to complete this lesson, you're going to need the Scientific Code of Conduct handout that I provided you in class. There's also a copy of the PDF file on the Veracross posting for this activity if you happen to not have it. But you'll definitely want to have that with you as you watch this video and complete the exercises that go along with it. What is meant by scientific ethics? We have talked in class before about the importance of observations and inferences connected by logic as the fundamental basis of science. And if we look up the word ethics in the dictionary, it basically just says a system of moral principles or the rules of conduct with respect to a particular culture. So when we think of the culture of science, you kind of have this slide that shows you what that is. And when we consider logic in science, we want to consider what is the source of our observations, how valid are those observations and the inferences that we draw from them, what sort of system of checks and balances is there, and in science that's commonly referred to as peer review, where you have others review your work to check for errors or to give a different viewpoint on it. And there's this fundamental idea that science is supposed to be for the common good. The idea of being a mad scientist is not really what science is about, even though there have been historical examples of people that have been essentially doing evil in the name of science. That's really not science, because by definition, science should be for helping and advancing society. Together, this is a word we've brought in many times in class already, trust. Science is not really about knowing everything, but it's developing the best understanding that we can get of the way natural systems work. And because we don't know everything, we have to have a certain amount of faith or a certain amount of trust that the process is going to give us usable information. Trust that if we build this bridge, it's going to hold the trucks that are driving across it. Trust that if we conduct this experiment, we're going to get a certain compound produced in the end. Integrity, trust, a sense of believability in the work of science is extremely important for it to having any sort of meaning in our daily lives. There have definitely been some examples out there where scientific trust has been breached. If we look through the Science Code of Conduct really quickly, you'll see things like inferences must be supported by observations. You have to identify your sources. If you have outside influence or prejudices, those must be clearly disclosed. And there on number 6 on the handout, you see fabrication or falsification of data for any reason is a violation of the fundamental trust of scientists. There was a case in, it's been several years ago now, where a scientific group claimed to have created cold fusion. And cold fusion is essentially when you create a star that's at room temperature. It's this idea that you take hydrogen atoms and you fuse them together, and they create essentially a limitless supply of energy, but instead of being at the extremely high temperatures of a star, it happens at room temperature, which would be great. Put a fusion engine in your car and drive wherever you want to. There was a group that claimed to have done it, and nobody could repeat their work. And eventually it turned out that they really had just faked all the data, and it wasn't real at all. Those scientists no longer have a career in science as a result of it. That is one of the, kind of items that would doom your career as a scientist if you're ever caught fabricating data. You can make a lot of mistakes as a scientist and be forgiven. Making up data is not one of them. The idea of crediting your sources, not necessarily directly scientific experimentation, but there was a case a couple years back when the superintendent of Newton Public Schools was fined because he plagiarized portions of a graduation speech from then Governor Deval Patrick. That's a bad situation. There was a case where singer Sheryl Crow claimed that she had a brain tumor caused by a cell phone. And when you look through the code of conduct, it talks about using proper methodologies, doing things properly, having conclusions be repeatable, having repeated trials there in number 8 before you go to publication. This was a situation where she was diagnosed with a benign, so a non-cancerous tumor in her head that happened to be where she tended to hold her cell phone next to her head. And so she said, well, I got a tumor on that side of my head, so it must have been caused by the cell phone. The problem is the scientific body of evidence did not support that. However, you had a famous person making these public statements about it, and it, for a short period of time, caused a little bit of a panic about whether or not cell phones caused cancer. There still has not been any conclusive evidence to say that they do. But this story still is out there from time to time. Another story that tends to linger is the connection between vaccines and autism. That connection was published a long time ago, and eventually it was disproven that the entire body of data used in that study was falsified, and now you have a generation of people that are refusing to get vaccinated because they believe that vaccines cause autism when the data really does not support that. Not getting into the debate about whether you should be vaccinated or not. You want to have that discussion with me sometime, great. But if you are deciding not to get vaccinated because of that study, that is kind of a bad situation to be in. More recent one, a company in California that claimed to be able to diagnose any disease with a couple of drops of blood from your finger. That would be wonderful. That would be like the closest we've ever been to the Star Trek scanner that you just scan across somebody's body and it tells them everything about them. But this was turned out to be totally fake. And the one trigger here was that they refused any sort of peer review of their work. They claimed it was, corporate secrets. They couldn't tell anybody how they did it. And under pressure, eventually it came out that they really were not doing what they said. And what was at one time a business worth several $billion is now shut down, and the owners of that company are being indicted on criminal charges as a result of it. A fairly recent one that shows up in italics on your code of conduct is an assertion that's been made that scientific data should be public, particularly if any public funding was used for the research. There has been historically these publishing houses that people will pay to submit their research papers to. Those publishing houses will get other scientists to review them for free, and then they will charge people access to the papers. And if you think about it, you're paying this, you're doing the research, you're doing the work, you're paying to submit it. The whole processing of the paper really doesn't cost anything because the reviewers are free and it doesn't cost much to post things online. But then people that might be able to use or peer review the data have to pay a fee to get to it. There's a lot of papers that I'd like you guys to go out and research, but you can't get at it because I'm not going to pay a $5,000 access fee for you to get online to get one research paper for your all of chemistry project. There's a real movement out there right now to consider that practice unethical, and so a lot of countries are starting to mandate that scientific data be free and open for access. One of those countries in the forefront of that is China. The United States is working toward that. There are several countries that have kind of benefited a lot from these fees charged for it that are resistant to the change, but in the future, really was the fundamental purpose of the internet. The internet was originally developed for the purpose of scientific information exchange, and I think ultimately it needs to get back to being a method for that. It's too important to have the free sharing of information to let business interests limit that process. So, scientific ethics, a method for developing trust and maintaining that trust. So I want you to reflect on some things. You have the reflection prompts, space to answer these in your handout. What are the possible consequences of a scientist publishing unsupported conclusions? What are the potential consequences to the scientist if they don't properly cite their sources? Take a moment and respond to these. You can pause the video and then pick it back up after you've done this. But reflect on those questions, and we'll wrap this up here after you've had a chance to do that. So the Science Code of Conduct, we've read through most of it. Support inferences, identify your opinions, cite your sources. Mad science is not good science. Disclose conflicts of interest. I'm not sure if you know what a conflict of interest is, so I thought I'd take a moment to clarify that. This cartoon really illustrates a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is when you have a particular motivation, either because somebody is paying you or it's a friend of yours or something like that. You have a particular motivation to come to one conclusion. But if other people don't know that and they find out about it, they may be like, well, gee, that company was paying them. They just, maybe they faked the data. The example here is, do you really want a shark as a lifeguard keeping an eye out for sharks? I don't think this would go over very well at the Cape. But in real estate, it's always a big deal of if the real estate agent that is representing the buyer of the home works for the same company as the real estate agent that is selling the home, whose interest are they working in? Because the seller wants to get the most money they can for the house. The buyer wants to pay the least that they can for the house. And who's really working for whom here? Real estate agencies do this all the time. I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything, but there is a law that requires that relationship to be disclosed, so at least you know it. And realtors are licensed; they have all these policies so that bad things don't happen. But certainly, if you didn't know that potential conflict of interest, that might lead you to think something that's not true. So in real estate, there are specific pieces of paperwork that have to be put out there to disclose the relationship between the realtor and the buyer and the seller and all of this. So, a clear case of conflict of interest in the scientific community is when pharmaceutical companies are responsible for their own testing for safety. Doesn't mean that their methods are bad. It just means that you have to understand that the company that is going to make money off of selling that drug may be the same one that tested it for safety. It doesn't mean they've done anything wrong, but it's just something to know. So that's why it says disclose conflicts of interest. Explain bad data. Don't erase it. Don't try to hide it, but explain it. Say, I know that data's a little weird, but here's why. So never falsify data. Use accepted methods, or if you think the accepted method is wrong, that's fine. You can define a new one, but just clearly define the process by which you did that. There was a case I was involved with where a state environmental protection agency was just requiring people to use the wrong formula for a calculation. We pointed it out to them in our paperwork, and they looked at it and they said, oh, okay. And we were able to use something different than the required method because we were able to show that the way we were doing it was more appropriate. Like everything, ignorance is not an excuse. You can say, well, I didn't know I couldn't do that. That's not accepted. Scientists are expected to know how to behave ethically. It's part of the reason why I'm teaching you this. And what I'd like you to do as a final piece of work for this is read this case study. The picture here goes with it. We have a geotechnical technician, and geotechnical technicians, one of the things they do is make sure that the ground is going to properly support a building that's going to be built on top of it. And in order to do that, you measure soil density using this yellow device on here called a Troxler gauge. It has a little piece of radioactive material in it, and as that radiation travels to the ground, the meter translates that into a soil density. If the soil is not dense enough, you have to compact it, you have to make it more solid so that the building will be properly supported. So this is a case study involving that situation. Read it over, answer the questions that follow, and then we'll come back together in class and look over these, discuss these things, and kind of wrap up our discussion of scientific ethics. Once again, thanks for completing the video. If you have questions, you can see me. But remember, just think about what you're doing, and if you do get into a situation where you've made a mistake in lab, it happens, we'll address it, you fix it, and we go on, but you never want to hide anything, and you never want to just fake data or copy it from somebody else without giving credit, because that really undermines the overall trust in the process of science. Remember your to-do list, read the code of conduct, 2 reflection questions, the case study, and I will see you back in class. Thank you.